Hi guys, and welcome to today's Drum Dog lesson. Now, a short while ago, I went to see one of my all-time favourite drummers at a clinic, and that was Matt Garsker. If you guys haven't already heard of Matt and his playing, then please go check out some videos because he's a really killer player. Now, one of my favourite concepts he talked about at this clinic was the idea of owning a pattern. He says that when he learns a new pattern, he doesn't just learn one pattern and then move on to the next. He'll sit on that one pattern until he's looked at every different angle and approach of it, and it's completely absorbed into his vocabulary. Now, at the clinic, he used a Herta as an example and then developed on different versions of it, and that's what I want to look at today. We're going to look at some of the concepts Matt spoke about, and we're going to push them even further to see how many places we can take the Herta to. Now, before I start today, all of the exercises in this lesson can be seen in a PDF that you can download down below in the description. Now, first things first, if you don't already know what a Herta is quite a nice little simple rudiment that's 2 16th notes and 2 8th notes played straight after one another. Now, that original Herta grouping adds up to a rhythmic space of 3 8th notes. And at Matt's clinic, he spoke about the concept of adding and removing notes to change the rhythmic space the Herta takes up and to fit it into new phrasings. The first and simplest way we can look at this is simply by removing the last 8th notes to having just 2 16ths and an 8th to make a phrasing of 2 8th notes. Notice that now we've removed the last note, the sticking changes for each repetition. Now, the next way we can add to this is by adding a note onto the original Herta, creating 2 16th notes and 3 8th notes, making a space of 4 8th notes as a rhythmic phrase. Now, if we add one more 8th note onto the end again, we get a phrasing of 5. And the interesting thing about 5 is that now we can actually add another 2 16ths in the middle to create this really interesting phrase. Now, I've left the phrasing of 6 out because that's simply 2 original Hertas in a row, but if we take those 2 Hertas and add 1 8th onto the end, then we get our phrasing for 7. Now, before you go any further, I really recommend you take the time to get really comfortable with these patterns because we're only going to be messing around with them even further. Now, the first way we're going to start messing around with these Herta phrasings creatively is by adding some accents into them. I'm going to give you 3 accent options that can be applied to any of the patterns that we just looked at. The first concept is going to be accenting the first of the 2 16th notes. The second option would be accenting the 8th that comes straight after the 2 16th notes. And the last option would be accenting all of the 8ths that follow those first 3 notes. Now, I'm not going to talk you through every possible example here because if you do the maths, it's going to make it a really long lesson, but I'm going to look at 2 examples and then I've left a space on the PDF for you to write in your own. Now, the first one we're going to look at is the phrasing of 4, which I'll remind you was this guy, with the accent concept number 3, which gives us this phrase. Which, as we start to speed up a little more, can sound really cool. And the second example I'm going to give you here would be the phrasing of 7 with accent option number 2, giving this cool little phrase. Now the second concept we're going to use to manipulate these Hertas even further is the idea of permutation. Now hopefully that should ring a bell to some of you, but for those who haven't heard of permutation already, it's simply the idea of taking a pattern and shifting all of the notes one beat back, and then the last note pops off the end and becomes the first note. Now again, I'm going to give you 2 examples, and there's a space on the PDF for you to write your own. Now this first permutation example is a nice simple one. We're taking the phrasing of 2, which in its root position again was this. We're shunting it all one beat forwards, and that last 8th note is now becoming the first note. For the second permutation example, we're going to be using the second option for the 5 phrasing, which in its root position sounded like this. And we're going to be pushing this onto a 3rd position, which means shifting the whole phrase forwards by 2 8th notes, and those last 2 8th notes become the first 2 notes. Now notice for all of the previous examples we haven't used any click or time reference at all, and that is because our third and final option for manipulating these Hertas is going to be putting them into different subdivisions. Now we've spoken about them being 8th notes and 16th notes, but there's nothing to say that those have to be straight 8ths or 16ths, or in fact triplets. Some of these phrases will lend themselves really well to sitting in triplets, and some of them will lend themselves really happily to sitting in straight 8ths and 16ths. Now, what can create some really cool ideas is forcing a pattern that would sit well in triplets into 16ths and vice versa. Let me give you a couple examples. Now for this first subdivision example, we're going to use the second version of the 5 phrasing again, and we're going to put this one through straight 8ths and 16ths, which sits perfectly in a bar of 5/4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And for the second subdivision example, we're going to be taking the phrasing of 4 and putting it through triplets. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, if you spend a little bit of time with the variations and concepts we've looked at so far, hopefully you'll already have a much stronger command over Hertas. But where we can create some of the most musical phrases is by taking all of those concepts and putting them into one phrase. Now, please do try this with some of your own patterns, because it's such a brilliant way of coming up with some new creative ideas. And the way it works is simply by going down the list of the things we've spoken about so far in this lesson, pick a core phrase at the top, pick where you're going to add some accents into it, pick the permutation of the phrase, and then put it through a subdivision. Here's a pattern I had a lot of fun making, which uses core phrase 2. It uses both of the first accent patterns. It's in the second permutation, and here's where it gets a little bit silly, is I've put it through quintuplets to really push myself on this one. Now it's all good and well using these concepts to make some cool patterns on the pad, but the true creativity comes from the different ways we can orchestrate these ideas on the kit. Let's look at a couple examples. There's nearly an endless number of patterns that can be created with combinations of these concepts, so please do try out your own, get creative and see what comes out. Now if you enjoyed this lesson, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the Drum Dog channel to check out more. We'll see you in the next one.